A mother can survive almost anything, except not knowing where her child is. For 6 years, every morning started exactly the same way. Wake up, look at the phone, wait. Maybe today would be the day. Maybe today would be the call. Maybe today someone would finally say, "We found her." Because somewhere out there was a daughter who had disappeared without a trace. No goodbye, no explanation, no final message. Nothing. Police believed she might simply be taking time away. Maybe dealing with mental health struggles. Maybe traveling. Maybe trying to disconnect from everyone around her. But her family couldn't understand one thing. Vacation doesn't explain silence. Vacation doesn't explain disappearing from work.
Vacation doesn't explain missing Mother's Day. And vacation definitely doesn't explain why the last person seen walking beside her kept changing his story. For years, there were no answers. Until workers entered an abandoned property in Cleveland and found a garbage bag. Inside was the answer a mother had spent 6 years praying she would never hear. This is the story of Paige Coffee. And this story doesn't begin with her disappearance. It begins with love. Because before Paige became a missing person, before the flyers, before the headlines, before investigators, she was simply somebody's entire world. December 8, 1991, Cleveland, Ohio. Paige Noelle Natasha Coffee entered a family that adored her from the moment she arrived. And being the first grandchild carries a kind of status that only some people understand. You become everybody's baby. Everybody watches you grow. Everybody remembers your firsts. Everybody protects you. Paige grew up surrounded by family. A brother, grandparents, cousins, aunts, people who loved her deeply. But there was one relationship everyone noticed immediately. Her bond with her mother, Trinetta. Some mothers and daughters are close. Then there are mothers and daughters who feel almost connected by instinct. People around them described them as inseparable. The kind of relationship where if something felt wrong, you knew it immediately. As Paige grew older, another part of her personality started becoming obvious. Creativity. Not ordinary creativity. The kind that showed up in how she dressed, how she expressed herself, how she saw the world. While other people saw clothing, Paige saw identity. She eventually attended high school, graduated, and later pursued fashion merchandising at university. That choice said something about her. Fashion isn't numbers on a spreadsheet. It's expression. It's personality. It's seeing beauty where other people don't. And people who knew Paige kept describing her with the same words. Dependable, creative, artistic, reliable. And later, those words would matter more than anyone realized. Because dependable people don't simply vanish. As Paige moved into adulthood, life seemed to follow a familiar path. She worked, built friendships, moved between different Cleveland suburbs, created routines, the small, ordinary things that quietly become a life. She eventually married her high school sweetheart. For years, it probably looked like the kind of story people expect to last forever. But sometimes relationships end not because of one moment, but because two people slowly become strangers. Their marriage eventually came to an end. Divorce is difficult enough on its own, but eventually life starts asking the same question it asks everyone. What happens next? For Paige, the answer appeared in the form of a new relationship. A man named Patrick Mason Jr. Most people knew him as PJ. And at first, like many relationships that later become destructive, nothing looked unusual from the outside. Because dangerous relationships rarely introduce themselves as dangerous. They don't walk through the front door and announce, "I'm going to destroy your life." They usually arrive disguised as comfort, attention, affection, someone to lean on. And by the time the warning signs appear, you're already emotionally invested. Over time, people close to Paige began noticing something changing. Not overnight, not all at once. Little things. Things that individually don't look important. But sometimes relationships end not because of one moment, but because two people slowly become strangers. Their marriage eventually came to an end. Divorce is difficult enough on its own, but eventually life starts asking the same question it asks everyone. What happens next? For Paige, the answer appeared in the form of a new relationship. A man named Patrick Mason Jr. Most people knew him as PJ. And at first, like many relationships that later become destructive, nothing looked unusual from the outside. Because dangerous relationships rarely introduce themselves as dangerous. They don't walk through the front door and announce, "I'm going to destroy your life." They usually arrive disguised as comfort, attention, affection, someone to lean on. And by the time the warning signs appear, you're already emotionally invested. Over time, people close to Paige began noticing something changing. Not overnight, not all at once. Little things. Things that individually don't look important.
But together, start forming a picture. Phone calls became different. Conversations felt different. Something wasn't right. And eventually, those concerns became impossible to ignore. Police were reportedly called to incidents involving the relationship on multiple occasions. Family members became worried. Friends became worried. And according to messages later reviewed during the investigation, Paige had allegedly described experiencing severe abuse, physical abuse, fear, control, pain. Now, abuse has a frightening way of changing reality, because people outside the relationship often ask questions like, "Why didn't she just leave?" But survivors often describe something completely different. Not a door they can simply walk through, but a maze. Fear on one side, love on another, manipulation everywhere. And somewhere inside all of it, hope. Hope that maybe things will improve. Hope that maybe the person you loved before is still in there somewhere. Hope can keep people in places they should never have to stay.
But eventually, something happened that seemed to change everything. There was an incident involving a gun. Conflicting accounts later emerged regarding what happened, and afterward, Paige reportedly told her mother she wanted out. Not temporarily, not another break. Done. Finished. No going back. For the people who loved her, maybe this felt like relief. Maybe they thought, okay, this is over now. Maybe they thought the worst had already happened. But sometimes, the most dangerous moment in an abusive relationship is leaving it. Because leaving changes the balance of control. And according to domestic violence experts, that can become an extremely high-risk period. Nobody around Paige knew it then, but they were moving toward a date that would divide life into two parts, before and after. April 30th, 2019. For most people, it was a normal Tuesday. For Paige's mother, it became a day replayed in her mind endlessly. Paige needed a ride. Nothing unusual. Nothing unusual. Families do things like that every day. You pick someone up. You drop someone off. You say, "Call me later." You assume you'll see him again. Her mother drove her where she needed to go, said goodbye, and drove away. Not realizing she had just experienced something people never realize while it's happening. The last ordinary moment. because ordinary moments only become important after they're gone. Days passed, then more days. Phone calls started going unanswered. Texts sat unopened. No return calls, no updates, nothing. At first, maybe you tell yourself, she's busy. Then, maybe your phone died. Then, something's wrong. And eventually, worry becomes something heavier, something colder. Because fear arrives quietly. And once it enters a room, it rarely leaves. Our mother started calling everyone. Friends, family, anyone. And eventually, PJ.
Something changed. Nobody knew exactly when. Nobody knew exactly where. But investigators would eventually focus on a question that became impossible to ignore. What happened after the cameras stopped recording? As concern turned into panic, Paige's family officially reported her missing. And this is where the story takes a turn that many families of missing people know far too well. Because sometimes families are not only fighting against time, they're also fighting to convince people that something is wrong at all. According to reports, early assumptions suggested that Paige may have voluntarily disappeared. Maybe she wanted space. Maybe she was dealing with mental health struggles. Maybe she'd simply gone somewhere on her own. But her mother kept coming back to the same thing. No, not Paige. Because mothers notice patterns, not the big obvious things, the tiny things, the things nobody else pays attention to. The exact way their child texts, the exact time they usually call, the tiny habits that become invisible to everyone except the people who love you most. And Paige had patterns. She called. She checked in. She showed up.
Dependable people build routines. Then suddenly, those routines had vanished. No calls, no work, no Mother's Day, nothing. Her mother wasn't asking investigators to solve a mystery overnight. She was asking them to understand who Paige actually was. Because if you misunderstand the person, you misunderstand the disappearance. Meanwhile, questions around PJ weren't disappearing either. Because according to family accounts and reports surrounding the case, inconsistencies started appearing. His explanations seemed to shift. His timeline became difficult to follow. And for Paige's loved ones, every answer felt like it created another question. Then, another disturbing detail emerged. His vehicle reportedly disappeared around the same period. Questions followed. What happened to it? Was it sold? When? To who? Investigators looked into it. But questions are not evidence. Suspicion is not evidence. And frustration began growing. Because true crime sometimes creates a dangerous illusion. People watch documentaries and imagine that investigators always discover a fingerprint, a confession,
A smoking gun. Real investigations are often messier. Real life doesn't always hand investigators the piece that suddenly makes everything clear. Sometimes detectives believe they're looking at the right person and still can't prove it. Knowing and proving are two completely different worlds. And in between those worlds, cases can stay frozen. Weeks became months. Months became years. Flyers faded. Seasons changed. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went. And every year carried the same horrible uncertainty. Is she cold? Is she scared? Is she hurt? Is she still alive? Imagine waking up every morning and not knowing whether the person you love most is out there somewhere needing help. Not knowing if they're suffering. Not knowing if they need you.
not knowing anything. That kind of uncertainty doesn't simply hurt. It slowly consumes people. But Paige's family refused to disappear quietly alongside her. They kept talking, kept searching, kept pushing. Because as long as they kept saying her name, Paige remained more than a case file. She remained a daughter.
If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please like and subscribe, because every victim deserves a voice.